There are three more immediate inferences that we are going to study in Chapter 3, Section 1. Those are obversion, conversion, and contraposition. As with the square of opposition, we will study these three immediate inferences from, respectively, the modern and traditional standpoints. Let's get started. We're now going to move on to a discussion of other immediate inferences. So when you make an immediate inference, you are making an inference from one proposition to another. So we've seen that on the modern interpretation of the universal, there are two immediate inferences on the square of opposition, namely the contradictories A and O and the contradictories E and I. Now what we want to do is look at what sorts of inferences we can make when we internally manipulate a given proposition. And the result is conversion, contraposition, and obversion. I do want to point out that it might be worth thinking about conversion and contraposition as mirroring each other. So conversion is going to be valid for two claim types, E and I, and contraposition is going to be valid for two claim types, A and O. The reason why I mention this is because most of us find that the contrapositive of a claim is very peculiar. It's not intuitive. And so if you think, okay, well, contraposition is just the symmetrical move for A and O propositions, and that move has a symmetry with conversion, or symmetry to conversion. So what do you do when you convert a claim? You switch the subject and predicate positions. What do you do when you contrapose a claim? First, or not necessarily first, but it makes more sense in some ways when you're writing things out, to switch the subject and predicate positions and then add the class complement to each. The class complement is articulated with the prefix non, and that tells us that we're talking about what is outside the class in question. And then obversion is valid for all four claim types. So you don't have to worry about restrictions, which you will see when we get to the traditional interpretation of the square of opposition and conversion, contraposition, and contraposition. So when you obvert a claim, you change the quality, and then you add the complement to the predicate class. Let's see how this looks when we're working on converting, contraposing, and obverting claims, and doing so with the Venn diagram might help you to see what is happening. Let's move on now to three more inference types that we can make. Remember that when we're talking about the square of when we're talking about the square of opposition, we're talking about immediate inferences, and then conversion, obversion, and contraposition are three further immediate inferences. What I'd like to do is talk about conversion and contraposition as mirror inference types, and I think doing so might make it easier to grasp contraposition, which gets a little bit difficult because it's not a particularly intuitive inference type. So first, though, let's take a look at what conversion looks like from the standpoint of a Venn diagram. So we're looking at pairs, one on top of the other. So the far left inference goes from top to bottom. That's a universal. And then the second pair from the left is also a universal, then a particular, and another particular. So the first inference is universal affirmative to universal affirmative. The second inference is universal negative to universal negative. The third inference from the left is particular affirmative to particular affirmative. And then the last inference, the far right, is particular negative to particular negative. Let's go back to the first one on the left. Notice that the top and the bottom Venn diagrams don't match. That's because when you switch the subject and predicate places of the universal affirmative claim, you get a different diagram. If we say all S are P, and then we say all P are S, we do not have identical diagrams. That's because the logical structure doesn't match up. Think about it this way. If I say all nurses are medical professionals, and then I switch the subject and predicate places, I get all medical professionals are nurses. But clearly, it doesn't follow that just because all nurses are medical professionals, that all medical professionals are nurses. In other words, the subject class of the universal affirmative is distributed, but that does not mean that the distribution works both ways. Hence, when we convert a universal affirmative, we do not get an equivalent claim. Another way to say this is that converting a universal affirmative does not yield a true claim, or we could say that converting a universal affirmative is not a valid inference. Take a look, though, at the universal negative and the particular affirmative. No S or P is equivalent to no P or S. Why is that? Well, it's because the subject class is distributed and the predicate class is also distributed. In other words, we have mutual exclusivity. If none of the S's are P's, it also follows that none of the P's are S's. Even though nothing is distributed in the particular affirmative, when we say some S are P, we're saying that there is at least one S that is also a P. Or, and this might be more helpful, there is at least one thing that is both an S and a P, so that we can say there is at least one thing, therefore, that is both a P and an S. Lastly, take a look at how the particular negative inference is not equivalent. It's not a valid inference, because saying that some S are not P does not tell us that some P are not S. Let's go back to an example. To say that some nurses are not certified phlebotomists does not allow us to infer that some certified phlebotomists are not nurses. Here are some examples. Take a look at the first sentence in each pair and determine that the sentence is true based on your understanding. But even if you say that you're not sure whether or not the sentence is true, you can assume that it's true. Remember, the examples are meant to give you something sort of tangible to hold on to, but they're not meant to be that in virtue or by virtue of which an inference is valid. So pause and read through each of these and see if you grasp how it is that the conversion move is not valid for A and O propositions, but is valid for E and I propositions. And then when you're ready, let's move on. Here are the diagrams, the Venn diagrams for contraposition. Now remember I said that contraposition is going to feel to you perhaps a bit counterintuitive. So you start with the standard form claim A, E, I, and O, which you see on the top row. And then for each inference, you have on the bottom row the diagram for the result. So the first far left, and then the second from the left, the third from the left, and the far right, those are pairs on the vertical. So A to contraposed A, E to contraposed E, I to contraposed I, and O to contraposed O. Now, if you're having some trouble understanding the introduction of the class complement in terms of wrapping your head around something like the E proposition that is contraposed, no non-P or non-S, don't worry, you're not alone. I have a video that focuses on the class complement. You might want to look at that. But it's also, again, worth mentioning that contraposition is the mirror to conversion. So remember, conversion on the modern interpretation is valid for E and I. It's not valid for A and O. Contraposition on the modern interpretation is valid for A and O, not for E and I. So you can see where the mirroring or symmetry lies. Take a look at these diagrams, read through the premise and then the inference, and see if the diagrams help you make sense of things. Here are some examples. Again, I'm trying to pump your intuitions about claims you believe are true, but also if you're not sure that the claim is true, you might want to go back to the Venn diagram to help you out. When you're ready, go ahead and move on, as we're going to finish the modern interpretation of immediate inferences discussion of obversion. Remember I mentioned in the slide that when discussing the slide that began the discussion of immediate inferences that are not on the square of opposition, I said that obversion is valid for all four claim types. Notice that the diagrams are identical from A to obverted claim, which is to its obverted claim, which is E, E to its obverted claim, which is A, I to its obverted claim, which is O, and O to its obverted claim, which is I. In addition, the obverted claim always adds the class complement to the predicate, and you'll see that the resulting diagrams are identical to the original. That tells you that since these statements, these propositions are logically equivalent, you can infer one from the other. Understand what is going on with the validity or invalidity of a given inference. So we've got conversion and contraposition on the two ends, and you'll notice that the A and the O are not valid for conversion. You can tell that by the, not only by what you already know, but by the X through the relevant boxes. And then the contrapositive is not valid for E and I. Again, you can tell that by the X's through the relevant boxes. Obversion, on the other hand, is valid for all four claim types. If you need a reminder of what to do when you take the converse, take the obverse, or take the contrapositive of a given claim, back up a few slides to where I offered you the procedure for each. I'll show it to you again right now if you don't want to back up through this video to the relevant slide, because I know that could be a little bit of a pain. So hold on just a sec. Okay, here are the steps. There's one step for conversion, 2 steps for contraposition, and 2 steps for obversion. We've been looking at the immediate inferences, obversion, conversion, and contraposition from the modern standpoint. That is, from the assumption that there is not existential import. In other words, we do not assume existential import from the modern or on the modern standpoint. But what does it mean then to say that we do assume existential import? In other words, let's review what it is to take the traditional or Aristotelian standpoint when we look at the universal proposition. We assume a member of the subject class in our 2 universal claims exists. So what we're going to want to do is distinguish between what's known as existential import, which is what reflects the traditional interpretation of the universal claim, from not assuming existential import, which is what reflects the modern interpretation of the universal claim. And when we understand the traditional Venn diagram, we understand in a new way or another way or a way that illuminates for us the inferences we are and are not allowed to make on the square of opposition. We'll also see why on the modern interpretation of the square of opposition, there is just one set of inferences allowed, contradictories, A and O, and E and I. Okay, so let me show you what you're looking at. If you take a look at the two circles, remember that we said when we're diagramming our propositions, rather than nesting circles or coming up with a different type of diagram for each proposition type, if we have two overlapping circles or two circles with an area of overlap, then that becomes our template for any of the four proposition types. These are called Venn diagrams. Now, the shading that you see, or in this specific case, the red lines, is going to represent emptiness. It's another way of saying that whatever S's there may be, they're all dumped into that area of overlap between the S and the P class. So on the traditional interpretation, when we say all S are P, we're saying that there's not even one S that is in the area of S outside of P. And by the way, the red circle, the red X that's circled tells us that in fact we assume there is an S. So think about it this way. When we say all dogs are animals, we assume there exists at least one member of the dog class. But now drop your eye down to the modern interpretation. The modern interpretation suspends judgment about existential import. And this helps us an awful lot when we think about propositions where we are pretty confident that the subject class is empty. All leprechauns are gold hoarders. All werewolves are frightening creatures. All vampires are blood-sucking undead. Those subject classes, leprechauns, werewolves, and vampires, don't have any members. So the modern interpretation says, look, whether we are talking about dogs, cats, tables, chairs, vampires, werewolves, leprechauns, fairies, whatever, we're not going to assume a member of the subject class. That is going to just complicate our inferences. In other words, the modern interpretation says that by not assuming existential import, we free ourselves completely from ever needing to know about the truth value of the proposition in question. Now let's take a look at the Venn diagrams for E propositions. The traditional interpretation, again, assumes a member of the subject class. And just as an aside, technically both the S and the P class assume membership. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But you can see that in both the traditional and the modern interpretation, the area of overlap is shaded. What that means is that the area of overlap between S and P is empty. There's nothing there. There can't be anything there. The traditional interpretation says no SRP, and by the way, we're assuming a member of the S class. The modern interpretation says no SRP, and we don't assume a member of the S class exists. Now, the Venn diagrams for I and O propositions are the same in both the modern and traditional interpretations because the modern and traditional interpretations are of the universal propositions alone. The interpretations do not impact at all the particular or existential claims, some S are P, some S are not P. Your I proposition has an X in the area of overlap, which denotes that there is an S and it's also a P. That's why it's in the area of overlap. The X outside the S class in the O proposition says there is an S and it is outside the P class. Another way you might consider this when you're thinking about the concept of distribution is that the P class rejects or precludes any S from participating in it or from being a part of it. So there is at least one S that is completely outside of P. Now let's review obversion, conversion, and contraposition. Remember we said that the square of opposition on both the traditional and the modern interpretation is about making inferences between proposition types, between A and E, for example, or O and A. Obversion, conversion, and contraposition, on the other hand, are inferences that involve manipulating the proposition itself, not moving from one proposition to another. In other words, what we do with obversion, conversion, and contraposition is we take we take a specific claim type, not a particular claim. A particular claim is an O or an I claim. So to be more exacting, with obversion, conversion, and contraposition, we take a specific claim type and we manipulate its internal structure to see if the result is equivalent to the original. That's a really important point to remember. We're looking for equivalences. And I think you'll see these equivalences clearly by the Venn diagrams that we look at in a little bit. So first off, obversion. Obversion is the most robust immediate inference involving manipulation of a proposition's internal structure. It's the most robust because it's valid for all four claim types on both the traditional and modern interpretations. So here's what we do. We take a proposition and we change its quality. Remember, quantity is the how much, universal or particular. Quality is the mode or the in what way, which means affirmative or negative. So we leave the quantity alone, we change the quality, and we add the complement or a complement to the predicate. Now, the complement of a claim, remember, is everything outside of that class. And linguistically, that's designated with the expression non. So we get the following. The universal affirmative, all S are P, becomes no S are non-P. No S are P becomes all S are non-P. Some S are P becomes some S are not non-P. And some S are not P becomes some S are non-P. What you might consider doing is taking sentences that make sense to you. So, for example, all dogs are animals, right? And obverting each sentence so that you can have a more tangible understanding of how the logical structure of the obverted claim is equivalent to the original. Conversion is valid for E and I propositions on both interpretations. So it's got a restricted scope. In addition, conversion is valid by limitation for A propositions, but only on the traditional interpretation. In addition, conversion is never valid for O propositions. I think that you will more clearly recognize how conversion is or is not legitimate or is legitimate in a restricted way when you look at the converted claims, but also when you look at the Venn diagrams. So first off, conversion involves swapping or switching or changing the subject and predicate position. You'll see that for conversion by limitation, which works only on the A proposition, we first subalternate. In other words, we first move to the subaltern, which is an I claim, and then we convert the I claim. So let's look at our converted propositions. First, the A proposition becomes all P or S. If you think of a couple of examples that are tangible, you should recognize why this proposition, why this inference is not legitimate. If I say all dogs are animals, and then I infer from that that all animals are dogs, we come up with a false proposition. On the other hand, if we say first that all dogs are animals, therefore some dogs are animals, therefore some animals are dogs, we're in good shape. That's conversion by limitation. Now let's look at the E proposition and its conversion. So no S or P becomes no P or S. If it's true that no rabbits are donkeys, it's also true that no donkeys are rabbits. Some S or P becomes some P or S. If it's true that some animals are dogs, it's also true that some dogs are animals. The O proposition, though, is never going to yield a valid conversion. Some S are not P is converted to some P are not S, but the inference is not valid. That's because some P are not S is not equivalent to some S are not P. If I say that some smartphones are not Androids, I am not saying the same things when I say some Androids are not smartphones. Lastly, let's look at contraposition. Contraposition does for A and O propositions what conversion does for E and I. Contraposition is valid for A and O propositions on both interpretations, valid by limitation for E propositions on the traditional interpretation only, just as, remember, conversion was valid on both interpretations for E and I, but valid by limitation on the traditional interpretation only for A. Similarly, contraposition is never valid for I propositions, and remember, conversion is never valid for O propositions. So we have mirror immediate inferences. There are two steps involved in contraposition for A and O propositions and for I propositions, and 3 steps for contraposition by limitation for E propositions. And actually, to be more exacting, I should say, there are 2 steps to contrapose A, E, I, and O propositions, and there are 3 steps to validly contrapose the E proposition. So what do? Well, we change the subject and predicate terms just like we do in conversion, but we have an additional step, which is to add the complement to each of the subject and predicate terms. So all S are P becomes all non-P are non-S. No S are P becomes no non-P are non-S. Some S are P becomes some non-P are non-S. And lastly, some S are not P becomes some non-P are not non-S. Now, if you're feeling a little bit dizzy because of all of the nons and the nos flying around, don't be surprised. It's normal. These are not super intuitive for us. I think, again, looking at tangible examples will help you. In addition, when we look at the Venn diagrams, I think you'll have a visual, having a visual representation of these logical structures will help you see their equivalences and why, when they're not equivalent, they're not equivalent. Before we move on, Let's do what we did in conversion for the A proposition. Let's do that for the E proposition here in contraposition. When we say no S or P, if we drop down to some S are not P, and then we contrapose the claim, we've got a legitimate inference. We've got an equivalent inference, or an equivalent statement, an equivalent proposition. That's because, as we've seen already, contraposition for O propositions yields an equivalent proposition to the original. Remember, I noted that conversion and contraposition are mirror inferences. Conversion is valid on both interpretations for E and I. Contraposition is valid on both interpretations for A and O. Conversion is never valid for O propositions. Contraposition is never valid for I propositions. Conversion is valid by limitation on the traditional interpretation only for A propositions. Contraposition is valid by limitation only on the traditional interpretation for E propositions. Oh boy, that's a lot to think about. Let's look at this literally by way of Venn diagrams. So obversion, as you can see, is valid for all four claim types. Why is it valid for all four claim types? Well, notice that the obverted claim is visually the same as the original. Pause for a moment and look at each diagram. Notice that conversion on the traditional interpretation forces us to restrict the A proposition or to limit the A proposition to an I. So we first make the move from A to I, then we see that the conversion is equivalent to the original I proposition. But if we just convert the A proposition, we can see that the two diagrams are not equivalent. You'll see that the E and the I propositions are respectively equivalent to their originals. Notice that for the E proposition, I mentioned this earlier, but we assume existential import technically for both the subject and predicate classes because they're reciprocally distributed. Lastly, take a look at the O proposition. They don't match up, right? And there's no way to get them to match up. So the inference is not legitimate. So before we move on, think about this a little bit. Let me go back to obversion. When you have a diagram that's equivalent to the original, so here it is also for conversion, you have a valid inference. That's because these propositions logically say the same thing. Lastly, let's look at contraposition. We can see that the A proposition, when contraposed, is identical to the original. The same is also the case with the O proposition. But take a look at, respectively, E and I. They're hard to sort of wrap your head around in terms of saying no non-P or non-S or some non-P or non-S. And that's because these just aren't intuitive. But take a look at the diagrams and see if those help you to work through what the written statement asserts. I hope you found this tutorial on obversion, conversion, and contraposition helpful as you make your way through the material in Chapter 3 of An Introduction to Critical Thinking, or any critical thinking text that might present these concepts and skills.